here in verse 13. James' point, I think, is that every difficult circumstance, and all of us can identify that in ways that we want to, difficult circumstances that come into our lives, every difficult circumstance that enters a believer's life can either strengthen him if he obeys God and decides he's going to be true to God's Word, if he chooses to do that, or it can become a temptation to do evil if the believer chooses instead to doubt God and disobey His Word. Everything that happens to us, we have a choice. Will this be used to help us grow, or will it be used to help us sin as we give in to temptation? Well, James also says something here about God. God does not tempt people, and neither is God capable of being tempted. The prophet Habakkuk, back in the Old Testament, said in chapter 1 and verse 13, your eyes, as he's referring to God, are too pure to look on evil. He says in Habakkuk chapter 1 and verse 13, and the Lord spoke to Moses earlier, you see, in Leviticus 19:2, he said, speak to the entire assembly of Israel and say to them, be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Isaiah's vision in Isaiah 6:3 says, they, the seraphs and the angels, were calling to one another, and they were saying, holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is filled with His glory. God is a holy God. And in 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 16, the point is made that we are to be holy because God is holy. God cannot be tempted with evil. He is too pure to look at it and be tempted by it. God is holy. James then says in the text that neither does God tempt anyone. He cannot be tempted, nor does He tempt anyone. God allows trials to happen, and in them He allows temptation to happen, but He has promised not to allow more than believers can endure, and never without a way of escape. You don't have to do it. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13 is that well-known and I think often misinterpreted passage that tells us, no temptation has seized you except what is common to man. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you're tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. You see it. This passage is dealing with temptations that come to us as the result of trials and the accompanying temptations. They come to us as a result of trials, not whether you can endure pain of any kind, which is how this passage is oftentimes presented in our world. He's talking more about temptations that come as a result of trials. So when presented with trials in our lives and the accompanying temptations, we can choose whether to take the escape God provides or whether to give in and go against God's will and sin. Choice is up to us. James then proceeds to tell us how it oftentimes works in life, in our real lives. How does it work? People are tempted when we are drawn away and enticed by our own evil desires. The Word describes wild game that's being lured into traps in that time and place. being lured into traps, just as animals can be drawn to their deaths by attractive baits. Temptation, you see, promises people something good which is actually harmful. Then after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. James likens sin to a process that happens in somebody's life. It doesn't happen, you see, all of a sudden, usually, but it's a process like birth itself. And then it has you, but remember, God offers a way out. So take it. God doesn't tempt, nor can God be tempted. When difficulty comes, we all make the choice as to whether to trust God or whether to take the bait that is presented to us. Are you familiar with some Old Testament stories? I know you are. First there was Eve, and then Adam. God had said, "It's all yours. Just don't go eating from that tree in the middle of the garden, and you will be fine. It's all yours, but just leave that one alone." So along comes the serpent, early in Genesis. Along comes the serpent, and he says, God didn't really mean that, did he? Does he ever say that to you? God really didn't mean that, did he? And besides, you see, God has a jealous streak in him. He was lying about God, and he said, God has this jealous streak in him, and he doesn't want you to eat it, because you know what? When you do, your eyes will be opened, and you'll be smart like him. Yeah, that's what's going on. And you know what? It tastes good, and it looks good. And so why don't you just go ahead, because it'll be okay. And wouldn't you know it, the trap was laid with the fine-looking bait inside, and whammy, she took it, and sin was spawned. And we've never been the same. Was there a way out? Was there a way of escape? Absolutely. Trust God and do what he says. And do you remember David? What an individual. He'd been the shepherd boy, you remember? Taking care of the sheep and killing the lion, and on and on. He arose to be king. He was a man after God's own heart. He wrote psalms, and he sang psalms, and he played the harp, and he led the charge for the army of God into battle. And oh yeah, he showed great faith and courage when he took down that giant Goliath as just a boy. You remember that? He did that with a sling and a stone, but here he was. This was another day and another place. Boredom, I think, sat in. I don't know what he was thinking. He probably spent many nights walking on his rooftop, staring out at the sky above and looking at the tops of the buildings down below his palace. He had it all. He had a gorgeous home, and he had servants and wives and all you could want to eat and clothes and everything else. He had it all. He had the best car in his generation. God had blessed him indeed. And then he spotted her. The most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, bathing in her backyard. And he said, I want her. So word was sent. the woman came, a child was conceived, and David began looking for a way out of an embarrassing situation. He arranged to have her husband sent to the front lines of war. The enemy put him to death, and David thought he'd covered it up perfectly. That is until Nathan the prophet came in one day and he said, "I'd like to have a word with you, David." And then he knew God had been watching too. Now, God had given David a way out, hadn't he? Sure. Go back inside and shut the door. Think about some of the Psalms that you have written and the goodness of God in your life. But sin had its way. The bait was set. David couldn't resist, and sin evolved. But it wasn't God setting the trap. It was David's interest in sin, his Achilles heel, if you would, a moment of weakness, and sin took over. So let's get it straight. God doesn't tempt anyone. We're all tempted